Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax.
Connor Walsh's boots crunched through the frost-covered undergrowth as he made his way along the Hoh River Trail at 6:47 a.m. The October air bit at his face, carrying the dense, earthy smell of Olympic National Park's temperate rainforest. Mist clung to the towering Sitka spruces like ghostly fingers, reducing visibility to maybe 30 yards in any direction. He'd been out of the Ranger Service for 3 years now, but Dr. Patricia Hendricks had specifically requested him for this search. You know these trails better than anyone, Connor. Rebecca Martinez has been missing for 4 days, and the regular teams haven't found so much as a footprint. Connor adjusted his pack, feeling the familiar weight of his gear. Water, emergency rations, first aid kit, GPS device, satellite phone, compass, headlamp, rope, and his grandfather's hunting knife. Old habits. The GPS showed he was 2 miles from where Rebecca's abandoned Honda Civic had been found at the Salt Duke trailhead. The missing researcher was 31, a botanist from the University of Washington studying moss adaptation patterns in old-growth forests. According to her research notes, she'd planned a 3-day solo camping expedition to document specimens in remote sections of the Hoh River Valley. Her tent, sleeping bag, and most of her equipment remained in her car. Only her day pack and research materials were missing. Connor paused at a natural clearing where the morning light filtered through the canopy in pale columns. Something felt off. In 7 years as a ranger, he'd developed an instinct for reading the forest's moods. Today, the usual dawn chorus of birdsong seemed muted, incomplete. No chattering of squirrels, no rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. Even the ever-present drip of moisture from the trees sounded somehow wrong. He knelt beside a fallen cedar log, examining the moss-covered bark. His trained eye caught details others would miss, a small section where the moss had been recently disturbed, compressed, not by an animal. The pattern was wrong, too deliberate. Standing, Connor noticed his breath forming more visible clouds than it should, even in the cold morning air. The temperature was dropping, but there'd been no weather front predicted. He pulled out his phone to check the forecast, but had no signal. Standard for this deep in the park. At 7:23 a.m., Connor found the first real anomaly. A boot print in a muddy depression beside the trail, clear and fresh. Size 8, maybe 8.5. Rebecca Martinez wore a size 7 according to her file, but that wasn't what made Connor's pulse quicken. The print was oriented facing back toward the trailhead, not deeper into the forest. And it was positioned in the exact center of the mud, perfectly placed, as if someone had deliberately stepped there to leave a clear impression. Connor photographed the print from multiple angles, then studied the surrounding area. No other prints. No signs of how someone had reached this spot without leaving additional tracks. The nearest solid ground was 6 feet away, across dense ferns and moss. He'd need exceptional balance and careful planning to place a single boot print here without disturbing anything else. He activated his first specialized ability almost unconsciously. Exceptional tracking had always come naturally to Connor, a gift his Cherokee grandmother had recognized when he was 12. While others saw random scuffs and disturbances, he perceived patterns, stories written in bent grass and displaced stones. Following the invisible trail backward from the boot print, Connor found them. Subtle signs of passage that would be invisible to most searchers. A fern frond bent at an unnatural angle 20 yards north. A small stone displaced from its depression in the earth. Fresh scratches on tree bark exactly at shoulder height. Someone had passed this way recently, moving with deliberate care to minimize their trail. But they'd also left just enough sign for someone with Connor's skills to follow. Almost as if they wanted to be tracked. By 8:15 a.m., Connor had followed the hidden trail half a mile off the main path. The signs led consistently northeast toward a remote section of old-growth forest that few hikers ever penetrated. Here, the trees grew so densely that the canopy blocked most daylight even at midday. Moss hung in thick curtains from every branch, and the ground felt spongy and uncertain underfoot. The silence had become absolute. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustle of wind through leaves. Even Connor's own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the dense vegetation. He found the second anomaly at the base of a massive Douglas fir. Rebecca Martinez's field notebook lay open on a flat stone, positioned as if she'd simply set it down while taking notes. The pages showed detailed sketches of moss species, her handwriting neat and precise. But the notebook was bone dry despite the constant mist, and positioned in a shaft of sunlight that shouldn't have been able to penetrate the thick canopy above. Connor examined the scene without touching anything. No footprints around the stone, no signs of disturbance. The notebook appeared to have been placed there with surgical precision, another deliberately planted clue. His satellite phone buzzed with an incoming text. Impossible. He was miles from any cell tower, and the thick forest should have blocked satellite signals completely. The message was from an unknown number. She was studying adaptation patterns. I wonder what yours might be. A fellow researcher. Connor stared at the screen. The timestamp showed the message had been sent from inside the park, less than a mile from his current position. He tried calling the number but got no connection. The phone showed full satellite signal strength, another impossibility in this location. Someone was watching him. More than watching, someone with technical capabilities was playing games. Connor's second ability kicked in, nature reading. The unnatural silence, the wrong temperature patterns, the muted sounds, all indicated the presence of something that had disrupted the forest's normal rhythms. Large predators could have this effect, causing smaller animals to flee or hide. But this felt different, more calculated. The disruption was too complete, too systematic. At 9:30 a.m., following the continued trail of subtle signs, Connor reached a small clearing where the forest opened around a natural spring. The water bubbled up from underground, forming a clear pool before flowing away as a narrow creek. Under normal circumstances, this would be a gathering place for wildlife coming to drink. Today, it was empty. Even the water seemed to flow more quietly than it should. But positioned on a flat rock beside the spring, Connor found Rebecca Martinez's research sample containers, 12 small glass vials, each labeled in her careful handwriting, each containing different specimens of moss and lichen. They were arranged in a precise grid pattern, completely dry and undisturbed. Beside them lay a printed page that hadn't been there when the Forest Service conducted their initial search 4 days ago. Connor recognized it as an excerpt from an academic journal, the title visible: Predator-Prey Relationships in Human Evolution, a Theoretical Framework for Modern Survival Psychology by Dr. Simon Cross, Department of Anthropology, University of Oregon. The article was highlighted in several places. Modern humans have become dangerously separated from their survival instincts through civilization's protective barriers. Only through direct confrontation with genuine predation can we observe authentic adaptive responses. The most fascinating subjects are those with enhanced perceptual abilities who can appreciate the elegance of a well-designed survival scenario. True research requires controlled conditions where subjects can demonstrate their full potential without external interference. Connor felt ice in his stomach. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. Rebecca Martinez hadn't gotten lost or injured. She'd been taken by someone conducting some twisted form of research. And now Connor was apparently the next subject. His phone buzzed again, another message from the same unknown number. You found them faster than I calculated. Exceptional tracking indeed. I'm impressed, Ranger Walsh. Though I believe you're no longer officially a ranger, are you? Career derailed by that incident with the missing family 3 years ago. The one where your instincts led the search team in circles for a week while they died of exposure. Connor's hands tightened on the phone. The Kawamoto family. He'd never spoken publicly about what had really happened during that search, how something had deliberately confused his tracking abilities, left false signs, misdirected the rescue teams. By the time they'd found the bodies, exposure had claimed all 4 family members. The message continued. I've read your file, Connor. Every report, every incident. You have remarkable abilities that would be wasted in ordinary circumstances. Consider this an opportunity to test their true limits. Connor pocketed the phone and drew his hunting knife, testing its weight in his hand. Whoever Dr. Simon Cross was, he'd been planning this encounter for some time. The man knew Connor's history, his capabilities, even his deepest failures. But Cross was making one crucial mistake. He was treating this like an academic exercise, a controlled experiment. Connor had spent his life in genuine wilderness, facing real dangers with real consequences. Whatever games Cross wanted to play, he'd chosen the wrong opponent. At 10:45 a.m., Connor's third ability manifested itself. Human presence detection. Someone was watching him from approximately 50 yards to the southeast. The feeling came as a cold pressure at the base of his skull, a primal awareness that had saved his life more than once during his ranger years. He'd learned to trust this instinct absolutely. Without changing his posture or giving any sign he'd noticed, Connor continued examining the sample containers while mentally mapping the surrounding terrain. Thick forest in all directions, but to the southeast lay a natural ridgeline with good sightlines back to the spring. If someone wanted to observe without being detected, that's where they'd position themselves. Connor pocketed 2 of the sample containers and began moving away from the spring, heading northwest along the creek. To any observer, he'd appeared to be continuing his search pattern. In reality, he was positioning himself to circle around and approach the ridge from an unexpected angle. The watcher followed, maintaining distance. Connor could sense the presence moving parallel to his path, staying about 50 yards out. Whoever it was moved with considerable skill, probably using optical equipment to maintain visual contact. But they made one subtle error. They were staying too consistently at exactly 50 yards. The distance was too perfect, too measured. A natural pursuer would vary their distance based on terrain and cover. Dr. Cross was thinking like a researcher, not a predator. He was maintaining what he considered an optimal observation distance for his study. The realization gave Connor his first tactical advantage. At 11:20 a.m., Connor reached a section where the creek bent sharply around a rocky outcropping. The terrain forced his pursuer to either close distance or lose visual contact. Connor ducked behind the rocks and waited. His phone buzzed. "Attempting to circle behind me, Connor. Interesting tactic, but you're thinking too conventionally. I'm not where you think I am." Connor remained motionless, every sense alert. The message could be a bluff, an attempt to flush him from cover. But something in the forest's atmosphere had changed. The oppressive silence felt different now, less localized. Then he heard it, a faint mechanical whir from above. Looking up through the canopy, Connor caught a glimpse of movement. A small drone, nearly invisible against the gray sky, equipped with a camera and probably audio recording equipment. Dr. Cross wasn't watching from the ridgeline at all. He was observing remotely, safe from any attempt at direct confrontation. The phone buzzed again. "I see you've noticed my assistant. Fascinating how quickly your situational awareness adapted. Most subjects never look up." Connor studied the drone's movement pattern. It maintained position about 60 feet overhead, just visible through gaps in the canopy. Advanced equipment, probably military grade. Cross had invested serious money in his research project. But drones, had limitations: battery life, signal range, vulnerability to interference. And they revealed something important about Cross's psychology. He needed to observe, to record, to maintain scientific documentation of his experiment. That compulsion would eventually force him to get closer. Connor continued following the creek, now aware of his aerial surveillance but pretending ignorance. Let Cross think his advantage remained secret. Meanwhile, Connor was mapping the terrain ahead, looking for locations where the canopy grew too thick for drone surveillance, places where Cross would be forced to rely on more direct observation methods. At 12:30 p.m., Connor found what he was looking for. Ahead, the creek disappeared into a narrow gorge where massive fallen trees had created a natural tunnel system. The overhead canopy grew so dense that even on a bright day, the interior would be nearly black. No drone could maintain visual contact in there. But first, Connor activated his fourth ability: investigative intuition. Something was wrong with this entire scenario. Cross was too well prepared, too informed about Connor's specific abilities. The timing of Rebecca Martinez's disappearance, the request for Connor specifically to join the search, the precision with which he'd been led to each planted clue. None of it felt coincidental. Connor pulled out his satellite phone and scrolled back through his recent calls. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had contacted him 5 days ago, exactly 1 day before Rebecca Martinez was reported missing. But Connor had never given Hendricks his current number. He'd changed phones after leaving the Ranger Service, specifically to avoid being contacted about search and rescue operations. Someone had given Hendricks his number, someone who wanted Connor involved in this search from the beginning. The realization hit him like ice water. Dr. Simon Cross hadn't grabbed a random victim and then decided to toy with whoever came looking. He'd specifically selected Rebecca Martinez because he knew her disappearance would draw Connor into the forest. The entire scenario had been constructed as an elaborate trap. Connor was the real target. Rebecca Martinez was just bait. His phone buzzed. "I see you're beginning to understand the scope of my preparation. Rebecca was never the primary subject, Connor. She's safe, by the way. Sedated and secured, but unharmed. My research requires her survival for comparison data." The message continued. "You're wondering how I knew you'd respond to Dr. Hendricks's call. Simple answer. I've been studying you for 2 years, ever since the Kawamoto incident. Your psychological profile indicates a compulsive need to prove your abilities remain intact despite that failure. Guilt is such a powerful motivator." Connor felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain analytical. Cross was revealing critical information. Rebecca Martinez was alive, probably held somewhere within a reasonable distance. Cross had been observing Connor for 2 years, meaning he had long-term resources and planning capabilities. And most importantly, Cross needed to prove his intellectual superiority. The messages were getting longer, more detailed. His compulsion to explain would eventually become a weakness. At 1:15 p.m., Connor entered the natural tunnel system created by the fallen trees. Inside the maze of interlocked trunks and branches, visibility dropped to mere inches. Connor switched on his headlamp, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the dense wood and vegetation surrounding him. The air felt thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay and standing water. His satellite phone showed no signal. The drone's mechanical whir had disappeared, blocked by the natural barrier above. For the first time since early morning, Connor was truly alone and unobserved. He moved carefully through the tunnel system, using his natural orientation ability to maintain his sense of direction despite the winding, maze-like passages. This was Connor's element, a place where technology failed and primitive survival skills became paramount. 20 minutes later, Connor emerged from the tunnel system and immediately sensed something had changed. The oppressive silence of the forest had lifted slightly. Distant bird calls suggested the presence of normal wildlife. Whatever force had been disrupting the natural environment was no longer as concentrated in this area. His phone immediately buzzed with multiple messages. Impressive navigation through the deadfall maze. Most subjects become disoriented and panic. You're approaching the test site now. This is where we'll determine whether your reputation is justified. I should warn you, Rebecca Martinez is secured approximately 200 yards ahead, but reaching her will require you to demonstrate each of your specialized abilities under controlled conditions. Connor studied the terrain ahead. The forest opened into a series of natural clearings connected by narrow game trails. Excellent visibility for an observer, multiple approach routes, numerous places to position equipment or personnel. Cross had chosen his testing ground carefully. But Connor noticed something else. The drone was back, hovering just outside the clearing ahead. And positioned in trees around the perimeter, he could make out small reflective glints that might be cameras or other surveillance equipment. Cross had transformed this section of forest into an outdoor laboratory. Connor's phone displayed a final message. The woman is secured in the central clearing, inside a specially constructed shelter. 4 separate puzzles guard the approaches, each designed to test one of your abilities. Solve them all, and you'll find her unharmed. Fail, and you'll discover what happened to the Kawamoto family was merely practice for my current research. At 2:30 p.m., Connor began the direct confrontation phase. The first test appeared at the edge of the clearing, a complex pattern of disturbed ground, broken vegetation, and displaced stones. To most eyes, it would look like random forest debris, but Connor's exceptional tracking ability revealed it as an elaborate false trail system. Multiple sets of footprints led in different directions, some obviously fake, others subtly altered. Boot prints were mixed with bare footprints, animal tracks, and what appeared to be drag marks. The pattern was designed to create maximum confusion, to overload his tracking instincts with contradictory information. But Connor had seen this tactic before. During the Kawamoto search, someone had used similar misdirection techniques. Now he understood that Cross had been testing his abilities even then, preparing for this final confrontation. Connor knelt and began the methodical process of separating real signs from false ones. Fresh scratches on a tree trunk indicated genuine passage. A boot print with mud still moist showed actual weight distribution. Bent grass that would spring back within hours of being disturbed marked a true trail. Within 15 minutes, Connor had isolated the genuine path. A narrow track leading toward the center of the clearing, marked by subtle signs that only a master tracker could identify. The second test waited at the clearing's edge, a section of forest where every animal sound had stopped, where the air itself felt charged with unnatural tension. Connor's nature reading ability immediately identified the source. Human scent distributed through the area using some kind of dispersal system. Chemical fear pheromones, probably collected from previous victims, designed to trigger flight responses in wildlife and create an atmosphere of dread. But recognizing the manipulation allowed Connor to push past the psychological effect. The artificial fear markers were concentrated in a defensive perimeter around 3 specific trees. Avoid those trees, and the path forward became clear. The third test activated Connor's human presence detection. The unmistakable sensation of being watched by multiple observers from different positions. Not the single drone anymore, but human eyes from at least 3 directions. Cross had positioned assistants around the clearing, probably graduate students or research associates drawn into his project through academic manipulation. Connor mapped their positions through careful observation and environmental clues. A bird alarm call to the northeast indicated someone concealed in that direction. The subtle movement of vegetation to the west suggested another observer. The feeling of direct scrutiny from the south confirmed a third position. 3 assistants, probably armed with tranquilizer weapons rather than lethal force. Cross needed his subjects alive for research purposes, but they were positioned to drive Connor toward the center of the clearing, where the final test waited. The 4th test required Connor's investigative intuition to identify the specific approach route Cross wanted him to take. Multiple paths led toward the center of the clearing, but only one offered the optimal combination of visibility for Cross's cameras and tactical disadvantage for Connor. The path that followed the natural depression between 2 low ridges, providing perfect sight lines for observers while limiting Connor's escape options. It was exactly the route Connor would never choose. Instead, he selected the most tactically sound approach, a curved path that used available cover while maintaining multiple escape routes. At 3:45 p.m., Connor reached the center of the clearing. Rebecca Martinez sat inside a transparent plastic shelter, roughly the size of a camping tent. She appeared unconscious but breathing normally, secured to a folding chair with plastic restraints. Medical monitoring equipment attached to her arm suggested careful attention to her physical condition. Around the shelter, cameras on tripods recorded from multiple angles. Standing beside the shelter, a tall man in expensive outdoor gear waited with his hands clasped behind his back. Dr. Simon Cross, Connor presumed, mid-50s, graying beard, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked exactly like what he was, a university professor who'd lost his mind. "Remarkable," Cross said as Connor emerged from the tree line. "You navigated all 4 tests while rejecting the approach route I specifically designed for optimal observation. I've never had a subject demonstrate such complete tactical awareness." Connor kept his knife ready but didn't advance. "Let her go. Your research is with me." "Oh, she's quite safe. And yes, you're correct. She was always merely bait." Cross gestured toward the monitoring equipment. "But I needed behavioral baseline data from a control subject before introducing the primary variable. You." Cross began walking in a slow circle around the shelter, keeping Connor in sight. "Do you understand what you represent, Connor? You're an evolutionary throwback, a human whose survival instincts remain intact despite civilization's softening effects. Most modern humans have lost these capabilities entirely. They couldn't track a wounded deer across fresh snow. Is that what this is about? Some academic theory about human evolution?" Cross smiled. "Initially, yes. My doctoral thesis examined the degradation of survival instincts in post-industrial populations. I received tenure at Oregon, published extensively, built a respectable academic reputation." His expression darkened. "Then I proposed a research project to test these theories under controlled conditions. The University Ethics Board called my methods unconscionably dangerous to human subjects. They terminated my position, revoked my research credentials, destroyed my career." Connor kept his distance while Cross continued his circular patrol. The man was positioning himself to keep Connor from approaching the shelter directly, but he was also revealing his psychological state. Cross needed to justify his actions to prove his intellectual superiority. The compulsion to explain was becoming stronger. "But they were wrong, Connor. My methods produced genuine data about human adaptive capacity. Rebecca Martinez, for example, demonstrated remarkable creativity when I initially secured her. She fashioned lockpicks from her own hair clips, constructed distraction devices from available materials, even attempted to signal aircraft using reflected sunlight. All precisely the innovative responses my theories predicted from subjects under controlled stress. You tortured her. I challenged her. There's a significant difference." Cross paused beside one of the camera tripods. "And the results validated everything I hypothesized. Humans retain extraordinary survival capabilities when properly motivated. The academic establishment refused to recognize the value of such research, but I've continued my work independently." Connor noticed Cross's position had moved him slightly further from the shelter. Each step in his circular path was taking him incrementally away from Rebecca Martinez. The man's need to pontificate was overriding his tactical awareness. "You conducted unauthorized research on the Kawamoto family," Connor said, encouraging Cross to continue talking. "A preliminary test, yes. I needed to understand whether your tracking abilities could be systematically deceived. The family was collateral data, regrettable but necessary for calibrating my methods." Connor felt rage building again, but channeled it into tactical analysis. Cross had just confirmed he'd been responsible for the Kawamoto deaths, information that could be used against him if Connor survived this encounter. "This entire scenario today was designed to test your capabilities under optimal stress conditions," Cross continued. "Familiar terrain, a subject you feel responsible for rescuing, multiple sensory challenges, technological interference with your equipment, every variable calculated to produce maximum adaptive response." Cross had moved far enough from the shelter that Connor could reach Rebecca Martinez before Cross could interfere. But 3 assistants remained hidden in the surrounding forest, and Cross probably carried tranquilizer weapons of his own. Connor's 5th ability, natural orientation, provided the solution. Despite the clearing's open appearance, subtle terrain features created concealed approach routes. A shallow depression ran along the northern edge, deep enough to provide cover for a low crawl toward the shelter. Cross's assistants were positioned to observe the obvious approaches, but they'd missed the natural terrain feature. "I have one question," Connor said, drawing Cross's attention. "If you're such a brilliant researcher, why reveal your entire plan? Don't you think I'll use this information against you?" Cross laughed. "Because the experiment isn't finished, Connor. Everything you've experienced today was merely preliminary testing. The real research begins now, when I activate the final phase." Cross pulled a radio from his pocket and spoke into it. "Begin containment protocol. Subject has reached the test site." From 3 directions around the clearing, Connor heard the hiss of aerosol dispensers. Within seconds, a chemical fog began rolling across the clearing from multiple sources. Cross pulled a breathing mask from his jacket and fitted it over his face. "Aerosolized sedative." Cross's voice was muffled by the mask. "You have perhaps 90 seconds before motor function begins to deteriorate. The real test is whether your survival instincts can overcome pharmaceutical intervention." Connor held his breath and sprinted toward the depression along the northern edge of the clearing. The chemical fog was spreading rapidly, but hadn't yet reached ground level near the terrain feature he'd identified. Behind him, Cross was shouting into his radio. "He's moving faster than projected. Increased dispersal rate." Connor dropped into the shallow depression and began crawling toward the shelter. The natural terrain feature was deeper than he'd estimated, providing complete concealment from Cross's assistance. But the chemical fog was sinking toward ground level, and Connor could already feel slight dizziness from the small amount he'd inhaled. At the shelter, Rebecca Martinez was showing signs of consciousness, probably reacting to the noise and activity around her. Connor reached the transparent structure and began examining its construction. Heavy-duty plastic sheeting secured with metal clasps, designed to contain atmospheric conditions while allowing observation. Not locked, just latched. Connor opened the shelter and began cutting Rebecca's restraints with his hunting knife. She opened her eyes, groggy but aware. "Can you walk?" Connor whispered. "I think so. Who are you?" "Rescue team. We're getting out of here." Behind them, Connor could hear Cross shouting orders to his assistants. The chemical fog was thickening, and Connor's peripheral vision was beginning to blur slightly. They had maybe 30 seconds before the sedative effects became incapacitating. Connor helped Rebecca to her feet and guided her toward the eastern edge of the clearing, the direction that offered the best cover and the most direct route back to the main trail system. But as they reached the tree line, one of Cross's assistants emerged from concealment directly ahead. Young man, probably a graduate student, carrying what appeared to be a tranquilizer rifle. His face showed uncertainty, possibly questioning his involvement in Cross's research for the first time. "Stop right there," the assistant called. "Dr. Cross wants you both secured for the next phase of testing." Connor stepped protectively in front of Rebecca Martinez. His vision was blurring more seriously now, and his reaction time was definitely compromised. Direct confrontation would be risky. But Connor's sixth and final ability provided the solution: spatial memory. 5 years earlier, while conducting a search for lost hikers in this exact area, Connor had discovered a concealed cave system behind a rockfall along the eastern ridge. The entrance was hidden by vegetation and nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. But once inside, the caves connected to a network that emerged more than a mile away. This way, Connor guided Rebecca toward the ridgeline. Behind them, Cross was pursuing on foot, his breathing mask still in place. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Connor. The sedative will take effect within minutes." Connor found the hidden cave entrance exactly where his spatial memory placed it. 5 years hadn't changed the landscape significantly. He pulled aside the concealing vegetation and helped Rebecca into the narrow opening. "Can't see anything," Rebecca whispered. Connor switched on his headlamp, revealing a narrow tunnel that opened into a larger chamber ahead. "Stay close to me. I know where this leads." They entered the cave system just as Cross reached the ridgeline behind them. Connor could hear the professor shouting to his assistants, trying to coordinate a search of the area. But without Connor's specific knowledge of the cave location, they'd never find the entrance. In the safety of the underground chamber, Connor used his satellite phone to call for emergency extraction. The caves provided enough shelter from the forest canopy to maintain a clear signal. "This is Connor Walsh requesting immediate medical evacuation from grid reference 5847. I have a kidnapping victim who needs medical attention, and at least 4 suspects in the area conducting unauthorized research on human subjects." The rescue helicopter arrived 43 minutes later. From the safety of the helicopter, Connor watched as federal agents surrounded the clearing where Cross had conducted his research. The professor and his 3 assistants were taken into custody without resistance. Rebecca Martinez received medical attention and made a full recovery. Later investigation revealed that Cross had been conducting unauthorized human research for more than 3 years, with at least 12 documented victims. The Kawamoto family deaths were reclassified as homicides. Cross was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. But what stayed with Connor wasn't the successful rescue or the criminal conviction. It was the realization that his abilities, the tracking skills, environmental awareness, and survival instincts he'd developed over years in the wilderness represented something genuinely valuable in a world increasingly disconnected from natural environment. Cross had been wrong about evolution and human adaptation. People hadn't lost their survival capabilities. They'd simply never been taught to develop them. Connor returned to work as a private wilderness survival instructor, teaching others to recognize and strengthen the instincts that civilization tends to suppress. Because the most important lesson from his encounter with Dr. Simon Cross was this: predators exist in every environment, but so do the skills necessary to recognize and overcome them. The key is learning to trust abilities that modern life rarely requires us to use. In the deep forest, those abilities might mean the difference between life and death. And Connor Walsh would make sure others had the chance to discover what they were truly capable of surviving. Ryan Carter's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of his cabin outside Whitefish. The caller ID showed Glacier National Park Dispatch. He'd been expecting this call for 3 days. "Carter here. Ryan, it's Sarah. We need you on that missing photographer case. David Chen, 32, from Seattle. Last contact was 4 days ago near Bowman Lake. His rental car's still in the parking area." Ryan swung his legs out of bed, already calculating. Bowman Lake backcountry. Rugged terrain, early autumn weather turning unpredictable. Equipment? Professional grade, Nikon D850, telephoto lenses, camping gear. He was photographing wildlife migration patterns. I'll be there in 2 hours. Ryan dressed methodically, wool base layer, tactical pants, boots that had walked thousands of miles through Yellowstone's wilderness during his ranger years. His pack contained the essentials: GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency beacon, water purification tablets, rope, and the knife his grandfather had carried through Korea. Muscle memory guided his hands through the familiar ritual. The drive to Glacier took 90 minutes through mountain roads, glazed with early frost. Dawn broke pale and thin, casting long shadows between the pines. By 8:15 a.m., Ryan stood at the Bowman Lake trailhead, studying the parking area with eyes trained to read stories in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. David Chen's Honda Accord sat alone, a thin layer of frost on the windshield indicating it had been there overnight, multiple nights by the accumulation pattern. Ryan circled the vehicle, noting details. No signs of struggle. Driver's door unlocked. Keys on the passenger seat. Water bottle half empty in the cup holder. The photographer had planned to return. Ryan shouldered his pack and began walking the shoreline trail. Bowman Lake stretched before him, mirror still in the morning calm, surrounded by peaks already dusted with September snow. His first special ability, exceptional tracking, engaged automatically. Most people saw a well-used trail, packed earth, scattered footprints from dozens of hikers. Ryan saw individual stories: size 11 hiking boots, deep tread, slightly worn on the outside edge. David Chen's prints leading north along the lakeshore. The photographer had walked with purpose, stride consistent, pausing occasionally, probably for photos. Ryan followed the trail for 30 minutes, noting where Chen had stepped off the main path to approach the water's edge, where he'd climbed onto fallen logs for better angles. Then the first anomaly. At a bend where the trail curved away from the shoreline, Chen's footprints stopped, not gradually, not with signs of uncertainty or route finding. They simply ended, as if he'd vanished mid-step. Ryan knelt, studying the earth with the intensity that had made him legendary among Yellowstone search teams. The final print was complete, heel and toe clearly impressed in the soft soil. No scuff marks suggesting a stumble, no drag marks indicating he'd been pulled. The ground beyond showed no disturbance, until Ryan looked closer. There, 15 feet ahead, partially concealed by fallen leaves, the faint impression of the same boot print, but deeper, as if Chen had landed hard from a jump or fall. Between the two prints, nothing. Ryan's investigative intuition, his fourth ability, began to whisper. This wasn't right. Ryan spent 20 minutes examining the area. No blood, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. But his nature reading ability, his second special skill, detected something else. The forest felt wrong. Birds that should have been active in the morning feeding cycle were silent. Squirrels that typically chattered from the treetops had vanished. Even the insects seemed subdued. Animals knew when predators were near. Following the resumed trail of footprints, Ryan noticed subtle changes in Chen's gait. The stride shortened. The prints pressed deeper on the balls of the feet, suggesting increased alertness, maybe fear. Whatever had caused the photographer to leap or be transported 15 feet had put him on edge. The trail led upward, away from the lake, into dense timber. Ryan's natural orientation ability engaged unconsciously. Magnetic north lay 30 degrees to his left, the lake 200 yards behind and below, the nearest road 4 miles south-southeast. Even without his GPS, he knew exactly where he stood in the vast wilderness. By 10:30 a.m., Ryan had followed Chen's trail 2 miles into the backcountry. The photographer had been moving with purpose, following game trails and taking shortcuts that suggested either excellent outdoor skills or guidance from someone who knew the terrain intimately. The second anomaly appeared at a small clearing where Chen had obviously stopped to rest. Boot prints showed he'd sat on a fallen log, had removed his pack. The rectangular impression was clearly visible in a patch of soft earth. He'd eaten something, leaving scattered crumbs that had attracted ants. But there were other boot prints in the clearing. Size 8, shallow tread, military-style sole pattern. Someone had been watching Chen rest. Ryan's human presence detection ability, his fifth skill, suddenly activated. The hair on his neck stood up. Someone was watching him right now. He continued examining the ground, feigning absorption in his work, while his peripheral vision swept the surrounding tree line. Nothing visible, but the feeling persisted. Predator instincts honed by 6 years in bear country screamed warnings. He straightened slowly, made a show of checking his GPS, then called out, "Hello? Anyone out there? I'm with search and rescue." Silence. But the watching sensation intensified. Ryan resumed following the trail, but now his mind worked on multiple levels. Chen's disappearance was no accident. Someone had been tracking the photographer, probably for days. The leap gap in his footprints suggested either an ambush or a forced march at gunpoint, and that someone was now tracking Ryan. The trail climbed steadily through dense forest, switchbacking up a steep ridge. Chen's prints remained consistent. He was still walking under his own power, but with increasing caution. Twice, Ryan found places where the photographer had left the main trail to circle back and check his own path. Chen had known he was being followed. At noon, Ryan crested the ridge and found the third anomaly. Chen's expensive camera bag lay beside the trail, partially hidden beneath a pile of pine needles. Ryan approached carefully, scanning for tripwires or other signs of tampering. The bag was intact but empty. Camera, lenses, and accessories gone. But something else caught his attention. The pine needles covering the bag had been arranged too neatly. This was deliberate concealment, meant to be found by someone with tracking skills, a message or a test. Ryan's investigative intuition flared again. He was being led somewhere. Examining the area around the camera bag, Ryan discovered the fourth anomaly. A second set of military boot prints, but different from the size 8s in the clearing. These were size 6, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. 2 people working together. No, not together. The stride patterns, the spacing, the way the prints overlapped, told a different story. The size 8s had been following Chen. The size 6s had been following the size 8s. Someone was hunting the hunter. Ryan's spatial memory, his 6th and most powerful ability, engaged fully. Every detail of the terrain burned into his consciousness. The angle of afternoon light filtering through the canopy, the exact position of each significant tree, the precise contours of the ridge. This information would be permanently accessible, complete with GPS-accurate mental coordinates. The size 6 prints led north along the ridge spine, following a route that provided excellent vantage points over the trail below. Whoever made these tracks was highly skilled, choosing paths that offered concealment while maintaining visual contact with their quarry. Military training, definitely. As Ryan followed this third trail, his human presence detection ability began firing constant warnings. He was being observed from multiple positions, at least 2 people, maybe more, tracking his progress with professional competence. At 1:30 p.m., Ryan found David Chen's camera. The expensive Nikon D850 sat on a flat boulder beside a small stream, positioned as if the photographer had set it down momentarily. But Chen's trail didn't come near this location. Someone had placed the camera here, another deliberate breadcrumb. Ryan approached carefully, every sense alert. The camera appeared undamaged, but the memory card was missing. More significantly, someone had scratched a message into the rock beside it. Only the fit survive. Now Ryan understood. This wasn't a missing person case. It was a hunt, and he'd just become the prey. His natural orientation ability triangulated his position. 3 miles northeast of the trailhead, half a mile from a backcountry camping area called Hidden Meadow. Dense forest on 3 sides, steep cliff to the east, limited escape routes, exactly what a predator would choose for a kill zone. Ryan keyed his radio. Static. His GPS showed no signal. His cell phone displayed no service. Professional jamming equipment, probably military grade. As he considered his options, a voice called from the forest. Female, controlled, confident. Ryan Carter, former Yellowstone Ranger, currently freelance search and rescue. 6 years wilderness experience, specialized in tracking and recovery operations. Graduated top of your class from the National Search and Rescue School. Ryan spun toward the voice but saw nothing. Where's David Chen? Safe. For now, he proved. Adequate, cautious, observant, decent survival instincts. You're the real test. Test for what? A figure stepped from behind a massive pine 50 yards away. Woman, late 30s, military bearing. Short-cropped dark hair, tactical clothing, confident posture of someone accustomed to command. She carried no visible weapons, but her stance suggested extensive combat training. Elena Voss, former captain, military intelligence, 82nd Airborne, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I've been watching your work for 6 months, Carter. Impressive tracking skills. You found my trail markers faster than I anticipated. Ryan's mind raced. Trail markers. She'd been leading him deliberately. What do you want? I want to see if you're worthy of survival. Elena began walking closer, hands visible but ready. Civilization has made humans weak, soft, dependent on technology and infrastructure. When I was deployed, I watched elite soldiers die because they couldn't adapt when their gadgets failed. But occasionally, very rarely, I encountered someone with genuine survival capability, instinct, adaptability, the capacity to thrive when everything goes wrong. You're killing people. I'm testing them. Natural selection. David Chen passed the preliminary evaluation. He noticed my surveillance, attempted counter-tracking, showed resourcefulness under pressure. But he's not apex material. You, however, Elena smiled. Your reputation precedes you. The Yellowstone incident in 2019, lost hiker, blizzard conditions, equipment failures. You navigated 15 miles through whiteout conditions using dead reckoning and brought her out alive. Ryan remembered. Rebecca Martinez, hypothermic and delirious, GPS and radio dead from cold. He'd used stellar navigation and terrain association to find the evacuation point. That was my job. That was exceptional capability. The kind that emerges maybe once in 10,000 people. Elena stopped 30 yards away. Most humans are evolutionary dead weight, weak genetics perpetuated by medical intervention and social safety nets. But some carry the survival imperative that built our species. I find them. I test them. I eliminate the ones who fail. You're insane. Elena's expression hardened. I'm a realist. In Kandahar, I watched 12 good soldiers die because their lieutenant couldn't read terrain without satellite imagery. In Ramadi, an entire patrol was ambushed because their sergeant depended on electronic surveillance instead of developing situational awareness. Weakness kills not just the weak, but everyone around them. Ryan calculated distances and angles. Thick forest limited movement options. Elena had chosen her position carefully. Open ground behind her, multiple escape routes, high ground advantage, professional tactics. What happened to you over there? For the first time, Elena's composure cracked slightly. My unit was overrun. 37 personnel. I was the only survivor because I had skills beyond what the military taught. Real skills, instinct, the ability to become invisible, to move through hostile territory, to survive when everything goes to hell. The others died because they were dependent, soft, unprepared for reality. So you decided to play God. I decided to strengthen the species, remove the weak before they reproduce and spread their inadequacy. Elena's voice grew passionate. Every person I test is given a fair chance. Survival scenario, no artificial advantages, skills versus environment. Most fail. A few demonstrate potential. Fewer still show apex capability. Ryan's exceptional tracking ability suddenly provided crucial information. Elena's footprints in the soft soil showed a subtle favoring of her right leg. Old injury, probably shrapnel or bullet wound. It would affect her mobility in difficult terrain. What's my test? Survive until sunset. No equipment, no communication, no assistance. Just you, the wilderness, and me hunting you. Elena pulled a military-style knife from her boot. David Chen gets released unharmed if you last 6 hours. Fail, and you both disappear. And if I win, then you prove yourself worthy, and I find a new hunting ground. Elena's smile was predatory. But Ryan, I've been planning this for months. I know every trail, every hiding spot, every water source in a 10-mile radius. I've cached supplies and set electronic surveillance. This is my terrain now. Ryan nodded slowly. When do we start? Now. Elena melted back into the forest with professional competence. Ryan counted to 10, then moved. His natural orientation ability immediately engaged. Sunset in early September, approximately 7:30 p.m. Current time, 2:15 p.m. 5 hours and 15 minutes to survive against a trained killer on terrain she'd prepared for months. Ryan's tactical mind assessed the situation. Elena's advantages, superior weapons, prepared terrain, electronic surveillance, military training. His advantages, intimate knowledge of wilderness survival, tracking skills that could work in reverse, and 6 years of experience reading landscapes that most people couldn't comprehend. The key was understanding Elena's psychology. She was methodical, professional, supremely confident. She'd planned this hunt like a military operation. Establish perimeters, control key terrain features, force him into predetermined kill zones. But Elena had made one crucial error. She'd told him the rules. Ryan began moving east toward the cliff face. Counterintuitive. Most prey would flee toward open terrain, seeking escape routes. But Elena would anticipate that. She'd position herself to intercept retreating targets, probably with pre-positioned equipment covering the obvious exit points. The cliff offered different possibilities. Difficult terrain that would neutralize some of Elena's technological advantages. Vertical landscapes where his climbing experience would matter more than her weapons proficiency. As he moved through dense timber, Ryan's nature-reading ability provided constant updates. Bird alarm calls to his left. Elena was paralleling his course, staying about 100 yards out. Squirrel chatter ahead and to the right. Clear corridor, probably safe for the moment. Complete silence behind him. She hadn't positioned anyone for rear security. Solo operation. Elena was hunting alone, confident in her abilities. 20 minutes into the hunt, Ryan reached the cliff base. Limestone walls rose 200 feet, broken by ledges and cracks that offered climbing routes. His spatial memory catalogued every feature. This terrain map would be crucial if the hunt continued into darkness. Behind him, a branch snapped. Elena was closing distance, probably trying to flush him toward prepared positions. Ryan began climbing. His hands found familiar holds in the rough limestone. 6 years of technical rescues in Yellowstone's vertical terrain had given him skills that few people possessed. Within minutes, he'd gained 50 feet of elevation, moving laterally along a narrow ledge that provided concealment from below. From his elevated position, Ryan could see the forest canopy stretching toward the lake. His exceptional tracking ability worked in reverse now. He could read the landscape for signs of Elena's movement. There, a quarter-mile south, raven alarm calls indicating human presence. She was working a search pattern, probably assuming he'd continue east toward the road. Ryan moved along the ledge, seeking a position that offered multiple escape routes. His human presence detection ability remained quiet. Eleanor hadn't located him yet. The cliff had been the right choice. At 3:30 p.m., Ryan found what he was looking for. A narrow chimney in the rock face, hidden by overhanging trees, leading to a small cave 40 feet above the forest floor. Perfect concealment with multiple exit routes. He climbed carefully, leaving minimal sign. The cave was shallow but dry, with clear sightlines over his back trail. Ryan settled in to wait and observe. Elena was methodical, but methodical meant predictable. She'd search the obvious routes first, then expand her perimeter. Professional hunters followed patterns. From his concealed position, Ryan began reading the landscape with 6 years of experience. Elena's electronics would be powerful but limited by battery life and line-of-sight requirements. Her supplies would be cached at strategic points, probably near water sources and trail intersections. Her planned kill zones would offer clear fields of fire with limited escape routes. By 4:00 p.m., Ryan had identified her likely strategy. Elena would use the remaining daylight to search the primary escape routes, driving him toward prepared positions. As darkness fell, she'd rely increasingly on technology, night vision, motion sensors, electronic surveillance. The hunt would intensify after sunset. But Elena had underestimated one crucial factor. Ryan's spatial memory wasn't just accurate, it was comprehensive. During his approach to the cliff, he'd unconsciously cataloged every significant terrain feature, every potential hiding spot, every tactical advantage within a 2-mile radius. That information was now permanently accessible, creating a mental map more detailed than any GPS system. At 4:45 p.m., Elena made her first mistake. Ryan spotted her moving along a game trail 500 yards west, her tactical clothing visible against the autumn foliage. She was carrying an assault rifle, military grade, probably with electronic optics. But she was also moving with the confidence of someone who believed her prey was still fleeing randomly. Elena had assumed Ryan was panicking, making emotional decisions driven by fear. Instead, he'd been thinking tactically, using terrain advantages and his specialized skills. She was hunting the wrong person. Ryan began his own hunt. Using climbing skills developed in Yellowstone's technical terrain, he moved along the cliff face, staying well above Elena's probable detection capabilities. His natural orientation ability provided constant position updates. Elena was working a grid search pattern, methodical but predictable. At 5:15 p.m., Ryan made a crucial discovery. Elena had cached supplies in a small clearing 600 yards north of his position. Watching through binoculars, he observed her approach the cache, retrieve additional equipment, and continue her search pattern. But in those 30 seconds of observation, Ryan's investigative intuition provided the key insight. Elena's movement showed the subtle signs of her old injury, the slight favoring of her right leg, the careful way she negotiated uneven terrain, the brief pause before stepping down from elevated positions. Shrapnel damage to her left hip. It would affect her mobility significantly on steep or unstable terrain. The cliff face suddenly offered offensive possibilities. Ryan began moving toward a position that would allow him to control the high ground above Elena's most likely approach routes. His plan was simple: force her to fight on terrain that neutralized her advantages while amplifying his own. By 6 p.m., with 90 minutes remaining until sunset, Ryan had positioned himself on a ledge overlooking the main trail between Elena's supply cache and the lake. His spatial memory indicated this was the optimal route for someone attempting to intercept targets fleeing toward the trailhead. Elena appeared exactly where he'd predicted. She moved with professional competence, assault rifle ready, electronic equipment visible on her tactical vest. But she was searching downward, scanning the forest floor for signs of her prey. She hadn't considered that Ryan might have gained elevation advantage. From 40 feet above, Ryan called out, "Elena!" She spun toward his voice, rifle tracking upward, but the angle was wrong. Ryan was positioned behind an overhang that provided complete cover from below. "Impressive," Elena called back. "Most people would still be running. You're thinking tactically." "I had good teachers. Military. Grizzly bears. They don't follow rules of engagement." Elena laughed genuinely. "Even better. Apex predators are the most honest instructors." She began moving laterally, seeking a position with clear sightlines to his location. "You understand now. This isn't personal. This is evolution in action. Tell me about Kandahar." Elena's movement stopped. "What?" "Your unit. 37 dead. What really happened?" For several seconds, silence. Then Elena's voice, harder now. "Ambush. Coordinated attack on our convoy. RPGs, small arms, IEDs. Professional execution by fighters who understood terrain and tactics better than we did. And you survived because you were better trained?" "I survived because I was willing to do what others wouldn't. When the shooting started, most of my unit focused on following procedure. Radio for support, establish defensive positions, wait for extraction. I focused on staying alive." Ryan's exceptional tracking ability, applied to psychology instead of footprints, read the truth in Elena's voice. "You left them. I made tactical decisions based on reality instead of wishful thinking. You abandoned your unit to save yourself." Elena's response came as a snarl. "I saved myself because I was the only one with genuine survival capability. The others died because they were weak, dependent, unsuited for the realities of combat. And now you're proving your theory by murdering civilians. I'm strengthening the species by removing genetic dead weight." Ryan had what he needed. Elena's entire philosophy was psychological defense mechanism, justification for cowardice that had cost 36 lives. She wasn't testing others' survival capability. She was desperately trying to prove that her abandonment of her unit had been rational rather than selfish. "Where's David Chen?" "Safe. 2 miles north, secured but unharmed. He demonstrated adequate skills." "Show me." Elena laughed. "You have 45 minutes until sunset, Carter. Survive that long and we'll negotiate." Ryan moved along the ledge, staying concealed while repositioning for the final phase. Elena was psychologically compromised now, her carefully constructed rationalization challenged. Unstable opponents made tactical errors. At 6:30 p.m., Elena made her second mistake. She began climbing toward Ryan's position, using a route that required her to traverse steep, loose rock. Her injured hip affected her balance significantly, forcing her to move slowly and carefully. Meanwhile, Ryan used his superior climbing skills to gain even higher elevation. "You can't run forever," Elena called up. "This cliff dead ends in vertical walls. I've studied every route. I'm not running." Ryan had reached a position 50 feet above Elena's climbing route. The terrain below was steep scree slope, loose rock that would provide treacherous footing for someone with a hip injury. Perfect. Using skills learned during countless high-angle rescues, Ryan began systematically loosening rocks above Elena's position. Not enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to force her onto unstable terrain where her mobility limitations would matter. Clever, Elena acknowledged as small stones began raining down around her. Force me onto disadvantageous terrain, good tactical thinking. I learned from the best. Bears again. Mountain goats. They understand vertical terrain better than most humans. Elena continued climbing, but her progress slowed as she was forced to negotiate increasingly unstable footing. Ryan could see the frustration building. She was accustomed to controlling engagements, not being outmaneuvered by inferior opponents. At 7 p.m., with 30 minutes until sunset, Elena made her critical error. Frustrated by Ryan's tactical superiority, she abandoned careful movement, and began climbing aggressively, trying to close distance quickly. Her injured hip couldn't handle the increased stress on steep, loose terrain. Ryan heard her curse as her left foot slipped on unstable scree. She recovered quickly, but the moment of vulnerability had revealed her exact position and confirmed her mobility limitations. "Time's running out, Carter. Sunset in 30 minutes. "I know." Ryan began moving toward the decisive position. "Elena, what happened to the other survivors?" "Other survivors? Your tests, the ones who demonstrated adequate capability, where are they now?" Silence. Then, reluctantly, "Most people fail the tests." "How many have you killed?" 17 over 3 years. "But Carter, you need to understand. 17 murders. 17 eliminations of genetic weakness. Except for Chen, who showed potential, and you, assuming you survived the next 29 minutes. Ryan had reached his objective, a narrow ledge directly above a 50-foot cliff. Below, loose scree sloped steeply toward a vertical drop. Elena was climbing toward him, forced to traverse the most dangerous section of the route. "Elena, your unit in Kandahar, how many could you have saved if you'd stayed to fight?" "None. They were already dead. I made the rational choice. You made the coward's choice, and you've been killing people ever since to convince yourself it was justified." Elena's response came as a roar of rage. She abandoned all caution, scrambling upward aggressively, assault rifle slung across her back, using both hands for climbing. Her psychological composure had finally cracked. Ryan waited until she was committed to the steepest section of loose rock, then used his spatial memory to place the final piece of the puzzle. During his earlier reconnaissance, he'd noticed a large boulder balanced precariously on the ledge above Elena's climbing route. Glacial erratic, probably weighing several hundred pounds, held in place by centuries of accumulated debris. Using techniques learned during countless search and rescue operations, Ryan carefully cleared the supporting material from around the boulder's base. Not to drop it on Elena, that would be murder, but to destabilize it enough that any significant vibration would send it crashing down the scree slope. 15 minutes, Carter. Elena was 30 feet below and climbing hard, her fury overriding tactical judgment. Ryan positioned himself safely away from the boulder's potential path, then called down, "Elena, your survivors. How many are really still alive?" "Chen will survive if you do. That's the deal." "What about the others? The ones who passed your tests?" For a moment, Elena's climbing slowed. They disappointed me. Showed weakness when I tested them further. You killed them all. I eliminated genetic deadweight. Elena's rage-driven shout triggered a small avalanche of loose rocks. The boulder shifted slightly, debris cascading around its base. Ryan felt the massive stone settling into new position, increasingly unstable. "Last chance, Carter. Sunset in 10 minutes. Elena reached the base of the final cliff section, directly below the balanced boulder. She unslung her rifle, preparing to climb the last 30 feet with her weapon ready. In her fury, she'd positioned herself in the most dangerous possible location. Ryan made his decision. "Elena, your unit didn't die because they were weak. They died because you abandoned them." Elena's scream of fury echoed off the cliff walls. She began climbing aggressively, rifle in one hand, using her other hand and feet to ascend the near-vertical rock face. Every movement sent vibrations through the stone. The boulder shifted again. Small rocks cascaded down around Elena, but she continued climbing, consumed by rage and the need to prove her superiority. "You're not conducting evolution, Elena. You're just a coward who's been murdering innocent people to justify the worst decision of your life." "Shut up." Elena was 20 feet below now, climbing fast despite her injury. "I made the right choice. Survival of the fittest. Only the strong deserve to live." The boulder shifted one final time, settling into a new equilibrium that required only minimal additional disturbance. Elena was directly in its fall line, focused entirely on climbing toward her target. Ryan could have simply waited, let Elena climb within rifle range, where her fury and injured hip would make accurate shooting nearly impossible. Let her exhaust herself on vertical terrain where his climbing skills provided overwhelming advantage. Instead, he made a different choice. Elena, stop climbing. The rock above you is unstable. You're in danger. Elena paused, suspicion replacing rage. What? Glacial erratic, balanced boulder. Your climbing is destabilizing it. Move laterally away from this section. Nice try, Carter. Psychological warfare. Look up. See the fresh rock fall around the boulder's base? See how it's shifting when you climb? I'm not trying to trick you. I'm trying to keep you from getting killed. Elena studied the cliff face above her, finally noticing the obvious signs of instability. For a moment, tactical training overcame fury. She began moving laterally, seeking safer terrain. Then her psychological delusions reasserted themselves. Clever, but not clever enough. You're trying to herd me into a worse position. She resumed climbing directly upward toward the boulder. I've been planning this for months, Carter. I know every rock on this cliff. Ryan watched the boulder settle deeper into instability with each vibration from Elena's ascent. He could see the exact moment when it would let go. Probably when she reached the section 15 feet below his position, where the route required dynamic movement that would send maximum shock through the rock face. He had a choice. Warn her again, and probably be ignored, or let physics and Elena's own tactical errors solve the problem permanently. Ryan chose a third option. Using climbing techniques perfected during technical rescues, he rapidly descended the cliff face using a route parallel to Elena's ascent. His superior skills on vertical terrain allowed him to move much faster, despite the more difficult angle. Elena saw him coming and tried to unsling her rifle, but vertical climbing with an injured hip while carrying weapons required both hands. She couldn't shoot and climb simultaneously. Ryan reached Elena's position just as the boulder above shifted toward its tipping point. Her next upward movement would trigger the avalanche. Elena grabbed my hand. Now. Go to hell. The boulder is going to fall. Grab my hand or you're going to die. Elena looked up, finally seeing the obvious signs of impending collapse. The massive stone was visibly moving now, small rocks cascading steadily from its base. Her face went pale. This is a trick. This is physics. Grab my hand. For several seconds, Elena hesitated between fury and survival instinct. Then self-preservation won. She reached up and grasped Ryan's extended hand just as the boulder let go. Several 100 pounds of granite crashed down the cliff face, exactly where Elena had been climbing. The impact triggered a massive rockslide that continued for 30 seconds, transforming the entire route into an impassable debris field. Elena stared at the destruction, her rifle lost in the avalanche, her face showing dawning realization that Ryan had just saved her life. "Why?" she whispered. "Because saving people is what I do." Ryan helped Elena climb to a secure ledge as the sun touched the western horizon. Sunset had arrived, but the hunt was over. Elena sat heavily on the rock, her psychological armor finally cracking completely. "I could have killed you a dozen times today, but you didn't. I wanted to prove, I needed to show." She looked at her hands, shaking now. 36 people died because of me. 36 people died because of war. You survived because you made split-second decisions in an impossible situation. I left them. You survived. There's a difference. Elena was crying now, years of rationalization and self-justification crumbling. The others I killed, they weren't weak. They were just people, trying to enjoy nature, trying to live their lives. Where's David Chen? Hidden Meadow Campground, secured but unharmed. I have food and medical supplies cached there. Elena looked up at Ryan. You could have let the boulder kill me, would have solved everything cleanly. That's not who I am. Who are you? Ryan considered the question as darkness settled over the wilderness. Someone who learned that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about making choices that let you live with yourself afterward. Elena nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we go get David Chen. Then you turn yourself in and start making amends for what you've done. And if I run? Ryan stood, offering his hand to help Elena to her feet. Then I'll track you down. But I don't think you're going to run. I think you're tired of running. Elena accepted his assistance, wincing as her injured hip protested the movement. How did you know about the boulder? Spatial memory. I catalog everything when I'm in the wilderness. Occupational hazard. Ryan began preparing for the descent. Elena, your survival philosophy was wrong, but your tactical skills are exceptional. The military could use someone with your experience to train others. Real training, not testing. Teaching. After 17 murders, after making a choice to stop and start helping instead of hurting, they climbed down the cliff face as stars appeared overhead, Elena following Ryan's lead on the technical descent. At the base, she retrieved a small radio from her tactical vest and contacted David Chen, confirming his location and condition. He's safe, she reported, scared but unharmed. I told him he was being tested, but I never intended to hurt him. The others? I convinced myself they failed, but I think I was just looking for excuses. They began the 2-mile hike to Hidden Meadow, Elena limping slightly but keeping pace. As they walked through the darkness, she began telling Ryan about her other victims, names, locations, the specific triggers that had led to each killing. Information that would be crucial for law enforcement and the families seeking closure. Why are you helping me now? Ryan asked. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone treated me like a human being instead of a monster. Because you risked your life to save mine after I'd spent the day trying to kill you. Elena paused. Because maybe there's a difference between surviving and living. They found David Chen at Hidden Meadow. Cold, frightened, but physically unharmed. Elena had kept her word about his safety. The photographer embraced Ryan with desperate relief, then stepped back warily when he saw Elena. She's surrendering, Ryan explained. It's over. Elena removed her remaining weapons and handed them to Ryan. David, I'm sorry. You were never in real danger, but I know you couldn't have known that. What I did was inexcusable. David studied her face in the starlight. Are you the one who's been killing hikers? Yes. Why? Elena was quiet for a long moment. Because I was broken, and I didn't know how to fix myself except by hurting others. But that's going to stop now. They spent the night at Hidden Meadow, Elena sharing her cached supplies and food. As dawn broke over the mountains, Ryan led them out to the trailhead where law enforcement was waiting. Elena surrendered without resistance, providing detailed confessions and locations of evidence that would help solve 17 missing person cases. During the subsequent investigation and trial, Elena cooperated fully with authorities. She was sentenced to life in prison, but her testimony and inside knowledge of wilderness survival helped the FBI develop new training protocols for tracking dangerous fugitives in remote areas. David Chen recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to wildlife photography. He later dedicated a book of wilderness images to the searchers who risk everything to bring lost souls home. Ryan continued his search and rescue work, but with a deeper understanding of what it meant to save someone. Sometimes rescue meant finding lost hikers or injured climbers. Sometimes it meant recognizing that the most dangerous predators were people who had lost themselves in psychological wilderness. and that bringing them home required different kinds of tracking skills. 6 months later, Ryan received a letter from Elena in prison. She had enrolled in correspondence courses in psychology and criminal justice, working toward degrees that would let her counsel other veterans struggling with combat trauma and survivor guilt. She was teaching wilderness survival skills to prison staff and fellow inmates, channeling her expertise toward protection rather than predation. "You taught me that survival isn't about proving you're stronger than others," she wrote. "It's about choosing to become someone worth surviving as. Thank you for not giving up on my humanity when I had given up on it myself." Ryan kept the letter in his desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the most important rescue is helping people find their way back to themselves. The wilderness had taught him many lessons during his years as a ranger and searcher. But the most crucial one came from Elena Voss, that true survival meant not just staying alive, but staying human in the process. That the apex predator wasn't the one who could kill most efficiently, but the one who could choose mercy when mercy required the greatest courage. In the end, Ryan realized, the strongest people weren't those who could dominate others through force or fear. The strongest people were those who could extend compassion to someone who had tried to kill them, and see the lost human being behind the monster they had become. The mountains kept their secrets, and the wilderness remained dangerous. But Ryan continued his work with the knowledge that sometimes the most important tracking skills involved following not footprints in the soil, but the path back to humanity itself. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but Connor Mills was already awake, watching the gray pre-dawn light seep through his cabin windows. 23 years of wilderness work had programmed his internal clock better than any device. He rolled out of bed, muscles protesting only slightly. At 42, he was in better shape than most men half his age, a necessity when your office was thousands of acres of untamed mountain terrain. Coffee first. Always coffee first. The ritual grounded him, provided structure to days that could spiral into chaos without warning. As the pot gurgled to life, Connor reviewed his mental checklist for the elk population survey. GPS unit, backup compass, water, emergency supplies, rifle, though he hoped not to use it. The Park Service had reported unusual elk behavior in the Cataract Falls area, and Connor's job was to count heads and assess the herd's health. The weather forecast called for heavy fog by afternoon, typical for November in the Smokies. Connor had worked in worse conditions. Fog was just another variable to manage, like rain or snow or the occasional black bear with an attitude problem. By 5:15, he was loading his truck, methodically checking each piece of equipment. Radio, fresh batteries, first aid kit, trail markers. Connor had learned early in his ranger career that preparation prevented most emergencies. The unprepared ones usually created their own disasters. He drove the winding mountain roads in comfortable darkness, familiar with every curve and pothole. The truck's headlights carved temporary corridors through the forest, revealing glimpses of ancient trees and rocky outcroppings that had stood unchanged for centuries. Connor found peace in this permanence, especially after the chaos that had ended his ranger career 3 years ago. The Cataract Falls trailhead appeared in his headlights at 6:20 a.m. Connor parked, shouldered his pack, and checked his watch. Sunrise in 40 minutes. Perfect timing to catch the elk during their morning feeding routine. The trail began as a well-maintained gravel path, but Connor knew it would deteriorate quickly once he left the tourist zone. He moved with economical precision, each step placed with conscious intention. Years of tracking had taught him to read terrain like a language. The way leaves compressed, how branches bent, where water had passed. The forest spoke to those who knew how to listen. 20 minutes in, Connor paused. Something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, just a subtle shift in the forest's rhythm. He stood motionless, extending his senses. The usual morning symphony of bird calls seemed muted. A red squirrel that should have been chattering somewhere overhead was silent. Connor had learned to trust these impressions. Animals reacted to disturbances long before humans noticed anything amiss. He continued climbing, but slower now, attention heightened. The trail wound through a grove of old-growth hemlocks, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces between the undergrowth. Connor loved this section of forest. It felt timeless, disconnected from the world's accelerating madness. That's when he found the first footprint. Connor knelt beside the clear impression in a patch of soft soil. Boot print, size 11, recent, made within the last 12 hours. The tread pattern showed a high-quality hiking boot, the kind serious outdoorsmen preferred. Not unusual in itself. Plenty of hikers used this trail. But something about the print's placement bothered Connor. It was positioned perfectly in the center of the trail, as if the hiker had deliberately stepped there to leave a clear impression. Most people walking naturally would have stepped slightly off-center, following the path of least resistance. This print looked intentional. Connor photographed the print with his phone, then studied the surrounding area. No other clear tracks were visible, which was odd. A hiker heavy enough to leave such a deep impression should have left more evidence of their passage. He activated his first special ability without conscious thought. Exceptional tracking came as naturally as breathing after decades of practice. Connor's eyes began picking up details invisible to most observers. A scuff mark on a rock where someone had stepped, a barely bent twig at shin height, a fragment of dark thread caught on thorny undergrowth. The trail told a story, but it was a strange one. Someone had passed this way recently, but they were moving with unusual care, deliberately minimizing their sign except for that one obvious footprint. Professional hunters sometimes moved this way, military personnel, or someone who didn't want to be followed but needed to leave just enough evidence to guide a specific tracker. Connor felt the first touch of unease. In his experience, people who moved through wilderness with this level of skill rarely had innocent intentions. He continued climbing, now actively tracking. The mysterious hiker's trail diverged from the main path about half a mile ahead, angling northeast toward the area where the elk had been reported. Connor hesitated. His job was to count elk, not investigate random hikers. But his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The fog was beginning to form in the valleys below, wisps of gray reaching up through the trees like ghostly fingers. Connor checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. The weather was moving faster than predicted. He decided to follow the divergent trail for a few hundred yards, just to satisfy his curiosity. The tracker in him needed to understand why someone would leave such mixed signals. Obvious in one moment, invisible the next. The side trail led through increasingly rough terrain, over fallen logs and around massive boulders. Connor's boots found purchase on surfaces that would have challenged less experienced hikers. He was in his element here, moving through the forest with unconscious grace developed over decades of wilderness work. That's when he activated his second ability, nature reading. The forest around him was wrong. Not visibly wrong, but energetically disturbed. Connor had spent enough time in wild places to recognize the subtle signals when ecosystems were stressed. The bird silence he'd noticed earlier was more pronounced here. A family of chipmunks that should have been active were nowhere to be seen. Even the insects seemed subdued. Something had frightened the local wildlife recently, something significant enough to alter normal behavioral patterns across multiple species. Connor had seen this before, usually around predator kill sites or areas where humans had engaged in traumatic activity. He crested a small ridge and found himself looking down into a narrow valley. The morning sun, filtered through increasing cloud cover, illuminated a scene that made Connor's blood freeze. Scattered across the valley floor were approximately 30 elk carcasses. Connor descended quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Disease outbreak, poaching, some kind of environmental contamination. But as he reached the first carcass, His ranger training provided immediate answers that only raised more disturbing questions. These elk had been killed efficiently, professionally. Single shots to the head or neck, precise enough to drop each animal instantly. But they hadn't been butchered. The valuable meat was left to rot. The antlers, worth thousands to black market dealers, remained intact. Someone had slaughtered an entire elk herd and taken nothing. Connor photographed everything, his professional training overriding his emotional reaction to the waste. 32 animals, he counted, all adults, both males and females. The kills were recent, within the last 48 hours, judging by the state of decomposition. But the most disturbing discovery was the positioning. The carcasses weren't randomly scattered as they would be if the elk had been fleeing. They were arranged in a rough circle, as if the animals had been herded into this valley and killed systematically. Connor's exceptional tracking ability revealed the full scope of what had happened. Boot prints, the same size 11 pattern he'd found on the main trail, circled the valley. The killer had moved from position to position, taking careful shots. The elk, probably attracted by mineral deposits or concentrated food sources, had been trapped in a natural amphitheater with limited escape routes. It was the work of someone with advanced hunting skills, intimate knowledge of elk behavior, and access to high-quality weapons. But the motive remained incomprehensible. Connor had dealt with poachers before. They killed for profit, taking the most valuable parts and leaving quickly. This was something else entirely. He was photographing the last carcass when his third ability activated unbidden, human presence detection. Someone was watching him. The sensation hit Connor like cold water, a primitive awareness that prickled along his spine and raised the hair on his forearms. After 2 decades of working alone in wilderness areas, he had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to being observed. It had saved his life more than once. Connor continued his work, giving no indication he'd noticed anything, but his peripheral awareness expanded to maximum sensitivity. The watcher was positioned somewhere on the eastern ridge, approximately 200 yards away, professional distance for a sniper. Connor's mouth went dry. The elk massacre suddenly made horrifying sense. This wasn't random killing, it was preparation. Someone had cleared the local wildlife from this valley, eliminated witnesses, created a controlled environment. For what? Connor finished his photography and began moving casually toward the western edge of the valley, away from the watcher's position. He needed to reach his radio and call for backup before the first rifle shot cracked across the valley, just as Connor dove behind a granite outcropping. The bullet sparked off stone inches from where his head had been a moment before. High-powered rifle, precision scope. The shooter was good. Connor's military training from his army days kicked in automatically. He belly crawled deeper behind the rocks, assessing cover and concealment options. The granite formation provided temporary protection, but he was pinned down with limited escape routes. "Don't move, Ranger." The voice carried clearly across the valley, electronically amplified. "I'm not ready to end our game yet." Game. The word sent ice through Connor's veins. This wasn't random violence or even professional assassination. Someone had lured him here deliberately, using the elk massacre as bait. "You're probably wondering why I killed all these animals," the voice continued. "They weren't the target. They were just preparation, clearing the stage for our performance." Connor's mind raced. The mysterious footprint on the main trail, positioned perfectly where an experienced tracker would notice it. The divergent path leading directly to this valley. The elk massacre designed to hold his attention long enough for the shooter to get into position. Every detail had been calculated to bring Connor here, alone and vulnerable. "You have quite a reputation, Mr. Mills. 12 years as a park ranger, decorated military service, survival instructor. They say you can track a ghost through solid rock. Impressive credentials." The voice was educated, articulate. Not the rough speech patterns Connor associated with typical poachers or thrill killers. This person had research capabilities, access to personnel files, professional resources. "I've been studying you for months," the voice continued. "Your routines, your methods, your psychological profile. You're exactly what I've been looking for. A worthy test subject." Test subject. Connor's blood went even colder. He was dealing with someone who viewed human beings as experimental animals. The elk were practice. The amplified voice explained with clinical detachment. 32 kills, 32 perfect shots. But animals are predictable. They follow instinct, not reason. You, however, you represent a more interesting challenge. Connor's fourth ability, investigative intuition, began processing patterns his conscious mind hadn't yet recognized. The killer's speech patterns, the methodical preparation, the reference to psychological profiling. This person had advanced education, probably in behavioral sciences. The clinical terminology suggested medical or academic background. "You're wondering who I am," the voice continued, seeming to read Connor's thoughts. "My name is Dr. Marcus Vance, former professor of forensic anthropology at the University of Tennessee. Former expert witness in over 200 criminal cases. Former believer in justice and order and all the pretty lies society tells itself." The name meant nothing to Connor, but the bitterness in the voice spoke volumes. This was someone whose worldview had been shattered, whose faith in systems had been destroyed. Connor had seen that kind of psychological break before. It created the most dangerous type of killer. "5 years ago, I testified in the Mitchell family murder case," Vance continued. "Triple homicide, brutal, but seemingly random. I spent months analyzing crime scene evidence, building a forensic profile of the killer. My testimony put James Crawford on death row." Connor shifted position slightly, trying to spot the source of the amplified voice. Vance was using some kind of directional speaker system, making it difficult to pinpoint his exact location. 18 months later, Crawford died in prison. Suicide, they claimed, though I suspect it was murder disguised as suicide. 2 weeks after that, the real killer was arrested for an unrelated crime. DNA evidence proved he'd committed the Mitchell murders. My forensic analysis had been perfectly accurate. The killer matched my profile exactly. But the prosecutor had ignored my report and pursued Crawford based on circumstantial evidence. The valley fell silent except for the whisper of wind through dead leaves. Connor used the pause to belly crawl toward better cover, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid detection. "An innocent man died because of institutional incompetence," Vance resumed. "Crawford's mother killed herself 6 months later. His sister lost her house fighting legal bills. An entire family destroyed by a system that values conviction rates over truth." Connor reached a fallen tree trunk that offered slightly better protection. He was beginning to understand Vance's psychological motivation, but that knowledge only made the situation more dangerous. Killers with rational grievances were harder to predict than random psychopaths. "That case taught me something important," Vance continued. "Justice is an illusion. Law enforcement is theater. The system protects itself, not citizens. So, I decided to create my own justice, test people who claim special abilities, separate the capable from the incompetent." A chill ran through Connor that had nothing to do with mountain air. "How many people have you tested?" "You're number 7, Vance replied, satisfaction evident in his amplified voice. "Rangers, police officers, military personnel, all supposedly elite, all convinced of their own competence. You're the first to survive the initial phase." Connor's stomach churned. 6 people had died because of this madman's twisted philosophy. 6 professionals lured into elaborate death traps designed to prove some perverted point about human capability. "The others were disappointing," Vance continued conversationally. a police detective who couldn't track his own shadow, an army sergeant who panicked at the first rifle shot, a park ranger who got lost in his own forest. They all claimed special skills they didn't possess. "And if I pass your test?" Connor called out, knowing he needed to keep Vance talking while formulating an escape plan. "Then you prove that competence still exists in this degraded world. You justify my faith that some humans deserve to survive the coming collapse of civilization. And if I fail, then you join the others in demonstrating that modern society has bred weakness into our species. Either way, I advance human knowledge." Connor's fifth ability, natural orientation, was providing crucial information about terrain and escape routes even as Vance spoke. The valley had 3 exits, the path Connor had used to enter, a steep ravine to the north, and a narrow gap between rock formations on the south side. Vance's position on the eastern ridge covered the main path and northern ravine. The southern gap offered the best chance of escape. But Connor wasn't ready to run yet. His ranger training included crisis management protocols, and leaving an active killer in the wilderness violated everything he believed about protecting innocent people. "Dr. Vance," Connor called out, "you lost your family because the system failed. I understand that rage, but killing innocent people won't bring them back." The response came after a long pause, and the clinical detachment was replaced by raw emotion. "The Crawford family wasn't innocent. They were collateral damage in my education about reality. Just like the others were educational opportunities, just like you are." Connor realized with growing dread that Vance was beyond rational persuasion. The man had constructed an elaborate psychological framework to justify murder, and challenges to that framework only reinforced his paranoid worldview. The fog was thickening around the valley edges, beginning to reduce visibility. Connor had maybe 30 minutes before the entire area would be shrouded in gray mist. That could work for or against him, depending on how well-equipped Vance was. "Phase 2 of your test begins now," Vance announced. "You have until sunset to escape this valley. I'll be hunting you, using every advantage modern technology provides. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, GPS tracking. If you can evade me for 12 hours, you pass. If not..." The implications were clear. Connor was being hunted by someone with advanced equipment and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Someone who had planned this scenario for months and eliminated every variable he could control. Connor's radio crackled to life. Vance's voice came through his emergency channel. "I'm jamming all frequencies except this one. No backup is coming, no rescue helicopters, just you and me and 12 hours to determine whether you deserve to live." The psychological pressure was expertly applied. Connor was isolated, outgunned, and facing an opponent with superior resources. But Vance had made one crucial mistake. He was treating this like a controlled laboratory experiment, assuming he could predict and manage all variables. Connor began moving south through the heaviest cover available, using every stealth technique learned during military service and refined through decades of wilderness work. Vance might have technology and firepower, but Connor had something more valuable: intimate knowledge of how to survive in hostile environments with minimal resources. The fog continued thickening, reducing visibility to 50 yards in places. Connor used the concealment to change direction abruptly, hoping to confuse any thermal tracking. He was heading for the southern gap, but taking an indirect route that would make his destination less predictable. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. Connor froze, melting into motionlessness against a moss-covered boulder. After 30 seconds, he heard the whisper of fabric against branches. Vance was following, tracking him through the forest. Connor's exceptional tracking ability worked in reverse. If he could read sign left by others, he could minimize the sign he left himself. He began moving with exaggerated care, placing each step on solid surfaces that wouldn't hold footprints, avoiding branches that might snap or leaves that would rustle loudly. The southern gap appeared through the fog sooner than expected. Connor paused at the edge of the trees, studying the narrow passage between rock walls. It looked like an obvious escape route, which made it an obvious place for an ambush. His human presence detection ability remained silent. No watchers nearby, but that could mean Vance was positioned outside sensor range, or that Connor's abilities had limits he hadn't yet discovered. Connor chose speed over stealth, sprinting across the open ground toward the gap. No shots followed. He reached the rocky passage and immediately began climbing, using handholds carved by centuries of water erosion. The gap led upward at a steep angle, eventually opening onto a ridge system that connected to the main trail. 20 feet up the passage, Connor's boot dislodged a small stone that clattered down the rocky walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Connor winced, knowing he'd just announced his location to anyone within hearing range. The rifle shot came from above, not behind. Vance had anticipated Connor's escape route and positioned himself accordingly. The bullet ricocheted off stone 3 inches from Connor's left hand, sending granite fragments into his face. Predictable, Vance's voice echoed down from somewhere above. The competent escape route, chosen by someone with proper tactical training, but I've been preparing for months. I know this terrain better than you do. Connor pressed himself against the rock wall, trapped in the narrow passage with a sniper controlling the high ground. Classic military disaster scenario. His only options were retreat or advance, both equally suicidal. But Connor's 6th ability was beginning to activate. Spatial memory. Details from years of wilderness work were surfacing, including a memory from 8 years ago when he'd tracked an injured hiker through this exact area. There was another way out of this passage, a route so obscure that even detailed reconnaissance might have missed it. Halfway up the eastern wall, concealed by shadows and mineral staining that made it nearly invisible, was the opening to a horizontal crack in the rock formation. The crack extended approximately 20 feet back into the ridge, then angled upward to emerge well above Vance's current position. The opening was barely wide enough for a human body, and the passage beyond was tight enough to induce claustrophobia in most people. But Connor had used it once before to rescue a hiker trapped by sudden weather, and his spatial memory provided exact details of every twist and turn. He waited for another rifle shot to cover the sound, then lunged sideways into the crack. The space was so narrow, his shoulders scraped both walls simultaneously, and he had to exhale completely to squeeze through the tightest sections. But the passage led exactly where his memory promised, up and east, emerging onto the ridge 50 yards from where Vance expected him to appear. Connor crawled the final 10 feet on his belly, emerging behind a screen of rhododendron bushes. Through the foliage he could see Vance's position, a carefully constructed blind overlooking the main passage, complete with rifle rests and electronic equipment. For the first time since the nightmare began, Connor had a tactical advantage. Vance was focused on the passage below, confident his prey was trapped. The killer's attention was directed away from Connor's actual position. Connor had one chance to end this. Vance was armed with a high-powered rifle, but the weapon was designed for long-range precision, not close-quarters combat. If Connor could close the distance without being detected, his military hand-to-hand training would level the playing field. He began moving through the underbrush with infinite patience, covering 10 feet per minute to avoid making any sound that might alert his target. Vance continued watching the passage below, occasionally calling out taunts to keep Connor's morale undermined. The others broke much faster than this, Vance was saying. That police detective started crying after the first shot. Pathetic. You're showing more spine, but the outcome will be the same. Connor was now within 20 feet of Vance's position, close enough to see details of the killer's setup. Military-grade thermal scope, sound suppressor, spare ammunition neatly arranged for quick access. Electronic devices Connor couldn't identify, probably motion sensors and communication equipment. My research indicates you served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Vance continued, unaware he was being stalked. Combat experience, leadership commendations, but that was 20 years ago. Skills deteriorate, reflexes slow. Age defeats everyone eventually. 15 feet. Connor could see Vance clearly now, a lean man in his 50s, gray-bearded, wearing expensive outdoor gear. He looked more like a university professor on a hunting trip than a serial killer, which was probably the point. Crawford was 32 when he died, Vance said, his voice carrying new emotion. Never had a chance to prove his innocence, never had a chance to live the life stolen from him by institutional incompetence. 10 feet. Connor gathered himself for the final rush, muscles coiled like springs. One chance. If he missed or hesitated, Vance would turn that rifle around and end the game permanently. The system failed him, Vance continued, just like it fails everyone who trusts. Connor exploded out of the bushes, covering the final distance in 2 seconds. Vance spun with impressive speed for a man his age, but the rifle's length worked against him in close quarters. Connor's shoulder caught him in the midsection, driving him backward away from his weapon. They rolled down the rocky slope, grappling for advantage. Vance was stronger than his academic appearance suggested, and he fought with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview depended on proving his superiority. But Connor had 2 decades of wilderness conditioning and recent adrenaline to fuel his efforts. The struggle ended when Vance's head struck a granite outcropping with a sound like a dropped melon. He went limp instantly, blood trickling from his scalp into the fallen leaves. Connor checked for a pulse, found one, and quickly searched Vance's equipment. The electronic devices were more sophisticated than anything he'd expected. Satellite communication gear, thermal imaging, GPS tracking systems, military or intelligence-grade hardware that cost more than most people earned in a year. Connor's radio crackled with Vance's voice. Phase 3 activated. Backup protocols initiated. Game continues. Connor's blood turned to ice water. The voice was coming from a recording device set to broadcast on a timer. Vance had planned for the possibility of being captured or killed. Electronic beeping began emanating from Vance's backpack. Connor opened it carefully, revealing a device he recognized from his military training, a claymore mine wired to a digital timer showing 02:47 and counting down. 2 minutes and 47 seconds to live, unless Connor could defuse a military explosive he hadn't seen in 20 years. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from Army demolition training taking control. Red wire to negative terminal, black wire to positive, but only after disconnecting the backup detonator circuit. The timer continued counting down as Connor worked with surgical precision. 02:15, 02:14, 02:13. Connor found the backup circuit, a thin yellow wire running to a secondary timer hidden in the device's casing. He cut it with his multi-tool, and the main timer stuttered, but continued running. 01:45, 01:44, 01:43. The primary detonator was more complex than Connor remembered. 3 separate circuits, 2 of which were decoys designed to trigger the mine if cut incorrectly. Connor's military training had covered this exact scenario, but the knowledge was buried under decades of civilian life. 01:15, 01:14, 01:13. Connor closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember. Sergeant Martinez explaining demolition procedures in a desert training camp that felt like another lifetime. Always assume the obvious choice is wrong. Look for the circuit that seems least important. 0:45, 0:44, 0:43. There, a thin green wire tucked behind the main circuits, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Connor cut it with trembling fingers, and the timer stopped at 00:31. Silence filled the forest. Connor sat back on his heels, hands shaking from adrenaline overload. Vance had prepared for every contingency except failure followed by successful bomb disposal by someone with the right training. Connor checked Vance's pulse again, still alive but unconscious. The head wound looked serious but not immediately fatal. He used zip ties from his own pack to secure the killer's hands and feet, then activated his emergency beacon to call for search and rescue. The fog was beginning to lift as Connor waited for help to arrive. Weak sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the valley where 32 elk had died for no reason except one man's twisted need to prove a point about human weakness. Connor looked down at Vance's unconscious form and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at the senseless killing, pity for whatever trauma had broken this man's psyche so completely, relief that the killing spree was over. But mostly, Connor felt a quiet satisfaction that he'd proven something important, not about human weakness, but about resilience, about the value of skills earned through experience rather than theory, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. When the rescue helicopters arrived an hour later, they found Connor sitting calmly beside his captive, looking more like a park ranger completing routine paperwork than a man who'd just survived a deadly game of human chess. "You okay, Mills?" the lead paramedic asked as they loaded Vance onto a stretcher. Connor considered the question seriously. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." The nightmare was over, but Connor knew its lessons would stay with him forever. Some predators hunted with claws and fangs, others used intelligence and preparation. But the most dangerous hunters were those who'd convinced themselves their killing served a higher purpose. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying Vance toward justice and medical treatment, Connor began the long walk back to his truck. The forest around him was returning to normal, birds resuming their songs, small animals emerging from hiding places, the natural order reasserting itself after disruption. Connor Mills had survived Dr. Marcus Vance's twisted test, not through superior firepower or technology, but through old-fashioned skills earned over decades of honest work. It was a lesson worth remembering in an age that increasingly valued theory over practice, credentials over competence. The fog lifted completely as Connor reached the trailhead, revealing the ancient mountains in all their timeless majesty. Some things, Connor reflected, were stronger than human madness. Some things endured despite the worst people could do to them. He drove home through clearing skies, already planning his report for the authorities. 7 people had died because one man's faith in justice had been shattered. But the 8th had survived, and that survival proved something important about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and overcome. Connor Mills had passed his own test, not the artificial challenge designed by a killer, but the real test of character that came from choosing to protect others even when the cost was personal risk. That was a lesson no classroom could teach and no theory could explain. It was wisdom earned the hard way, in the places where civilized society ended and survival began. The satellite phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., cutting through the Montana silence like a blade. Nick Reynolds rolled over in his cabin bed, muscle memory already reaching for the device before his mind fully processed the sound. 5 years out of the Ranger service, but some reflexes never died. "Reynolds," he answered, voice rough with sleep. "Nick, it's Sarah from Park Services. Sorry to wake you, but we need your help." Sarah's voice carried that particular tension Nick remembered from his Ranger days, controlled panic wrapped in professional calm. "We've got a missing research team in Glacier, 3 scientists overdue by 18 hours. Nick sat up, instantly alert. October in Glacier National Park meant temperatures dropping fast after sunset, early snow possible, and daylight bleeding away by 5 p.m. 18 hours was already pushing into critical territory. What kind of research team? Geological Survey, Dr. Amanda Chen, Dr. Robert Kessler, and graduate student Lisa Park. They were studying mineral deposits in the Avalanche Creek area. Last contact was yesterday at 2 p.m. Nick's mind automatically cataloged the terrain: dense forest, rocky outcrops, multiple creek crossings, Dozens of animal trails that could confuse inexperienced hikers. Good hiding places, bad places to get lost. Equipment, basic camping gear, GPS units, satellite communicator. The communicator went dark around 4 p.m. yesterday. Weather forecast, snow possible tonight, temperature dropping to 28 degrees. Nick was already moving, pulling on thermal underwear, wool socks, boots. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He dressed systematically, muscle memory guiding each choice. Base layer, insulating layer, shell jacket, knife on his belt, compass in his pocket, headlamp around his neck. His old Ranger pack felt familiar on his shoulders. Emergency shelter, first aid kit, rope, flares, backup battery pack. The drive to the park took 35 minutes through winding mountain roads. Dawn was just touching the eastern peaks when he met Sarah at the ranger station, a compact woman in her 50s with worry lines creasing her forehead. The other search teams found nothing, she said, spreading a topographic map across the hood of his truck. But you know these woods better than anyone. Nick studied the map, his mind automatically processing elevation changes, water sources, natural shelter locations. The Avalanche Creek drainage was familiar territory. He'd worked dozens of rescues there during his ranger years. Show me their planned route. Sarah traced a red line with her finger. They were supposed to follow this trail to the mineral outcrop here, collect samples, and return by evening. Simple day hike. But Nick's exceptional tracking ability was already noting discrepancies. The planned route passed through 3 areas where inexperienced hikers commonly made wrong turns, and the mineral outcrop sat at the intersection of 4 different animal trails. I'll start at the trailhead, he said. Radio check every 2 hours. The trail began normally enough. Packed earth, occasional boot prints from previous hikers, the familiar scents of pine and decomposing leaves. Nick's trained eye automatically cataloged everything. Broken branches at shoulder height, disturbed moss, the faint impressions left by different boot treads. 15 minutes in, he found the first anomaly. A footprint, clear and deep in a muddy section beside the creek. Size 9 hiking boot, recent enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. But the print faced the wrong direction, pointing back toward the parking area instead of deeper into the woods. Nick knelt, studying the impression. The depth suggested someone carrying significant weight, but the stride length indicated they'd been moving carefully, deliberately, not the panicked scrambling of someone lost and trying to backtrack. He photographed the print, then continued following the trail. More footprints appeared, always in the muddiest sections where they'd be most visible. Too many footprints, actually. 3 researchers should have left fewer tracks, and these showed at least 4 different boot patterns. 20 minutes later, his nature reading ability kicked in with an observation that made him stop cold. The forest was wrong. Not obviously wrong. The casual hiker would notice nothing unusual. But Nick had spent enough years in these woods to recognize the subtle signs. Birds should have been active at this hour, but the canopy was silent. Squirrels should have been chattering in the branches, but he heard nothing. Even the insects seemed subdued. Animals fleeing an area usually meant one of 3 things: predator, fire, or human disturbance. No smoke in the air ruled out fire. Wrong season and wrong behavior pattern for predator. That left human disturbance. But what kind of human disturbance would clear animals from a half-mile radius? Nick activated his radio. Base, this is Reynolds. I'm about 30 minutes in. Found some unusual track patterns. Nothing urgent yet, but something feels off. Copy, Nick. Anything specific? Too many footprints for 3 people, and the wildlife spooked. Understood. Keep us posted. Nick continued deeper into the woods, his investigative intuition beginning to piece together an uncomfortable picture. The footprints appeared in a pattern too convenient for accident, always in the softest ground, always clear enough to read, like someone wanted them to be found. Professional trackers learned to distinguish between natural sign and manufactured sign. Natural sign told the story of normal movement, people walking without thinking about their tracks, leaving evidence in random patterns based on terrain and necessity. Manufactured sign was different, deliberate, placed for effect. These tracks felt manufactured. 45 minutes into the hike, Nick's human presence detection ability triggered like an alarm bell in his nervous system. He stopped mid-step, every sense suddenly hyper-alert. Someone was watching him. The sensation was unmistakable. A crawling awareness between his shoulder blades, the primitive recognition of predator eyes. Nick had felt it during dangerous animal encounters, during tense moments with unstable hikers, during the handful of truly scary situations his ranger career had provided. But this felt different, more focused, more intelligent. He continued walking but altered his pattern subtly, stepping more quietly, using peripheral vision to scan the forest around him. Whoever was watching him was good. No obvious movement, no sound, no visible sign. But the feeling persisted. Nick's natural orientation ability told him he was being paralleled from the north, probably 50 yards out, moving through the tree line just beyond visual range. Amateur stalkers made noise or showed themselves. This person was maintaining perfect concealment while matching his pace exactly. Professional-level surveillance. An hour into the search, Nick found the first piece of equipment. A GPS unit deliberately placed on a fallen log beside the trail. Not dropped, placed. The log sat at waist height, the perfect spot for a convenient rest stop. The GPS was clean, undamaged, and still powered on. Nick examined it without touching it. The screen showed a saved waypoint labeled "Game Begins," with coordinates that didn't match any location on his map. Below that, a text message. "Your reputation precedes you, Ranger Reynolds. Let's see if you're as good as they say." His blood temperature dropped 5 degrees. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was something else entirely. Nick activated his radio, but got only static. He checked his phone. No signal. Even his GPS was malfunctioning, showing his location as somewhere in the middle of Flathead Lake instead of the mountain trail. Equipment failures in the wilderness usually meant weather, user error, or simple mechanical breakdown. 3 different systems failing simultaneously meant sabotage. Someone had jammed his communications and disabled his GPS. Someone who wanted him isolated, cut off from support, operating alone in unfamiliar tactical conditions. Someone who knew exactly who he was. Nick's spatial memory kicked in, reconstructing the terrain around him from his years of ranger experience. He was approximately 1 mile from the trailhead, half a mile from the nearest road, and 3 miles from the closest populated area. Dense forest in all directions, multiple escape routes, good concealment, and perfect isolation. If someone wanted to test a former ranger's abilities against prepared opposition, this was exactly where they'd do it. Nick continued forward but shifted into combat awareness mode, scanning constantly, listening for the smallest sounds, keeping his back to trees when possible. His investigative intuition was screaming that this was no longer about finding 3 missing researchers. This was about him. 90 minutes into what was supposed to be a simple search and rescue, Nick found the second message. A piece of paper, weighted down with a stone, positioned exactly where the trail forked toward the mineral outcrop. Written in neat block letters, "The research team is safe. You are not. I've been watching your career, studying your methods, analyzing your capabilities. Today we discover if instinct can defeat preparation." Below that, a hand-drawn map showing a different route deeper into the wilderness, marked with the message, "Follow this path alone. Bring backup, and they die. Run away and they die. Play the game and they live." At the bottom, a signature, "The Architect." Nick studied the paper, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone had researched him specifically, had planned this encounter, had orchestrated the missing persons report to get him here alone. Someone with enough resources to jam electronics, enough knowledge to choose the perfect location, and enough confidence to challenge a former ranger on his home ground. Military background, Nick thought. The message style, the tactical approach, the nickname, the architect, all suggested someone with professional training in psychological operations. But why? What did someone want with a retired ranger living quietly in rural Montana? The hand-drawn map led northwest, away from established trails, into an area Nick knew was particularly dense and difficult to navigate. Perfect place for an ambush. Also, perfect place to hide 3 prisoners. Nick had 2 choices: follow the route and walk into whatever trap was waiting, or try to outflank his opponent and approach from an unexpected direction. His spatial memory provided a third option. 7 years ago, Nick had worked a search and rescue in this exact area for a lost climber. He'd discovered an old game trail that paralleled the main route, but stayed hidden in the heavy timber. If that trail was still passable, he could track his opponent's movements while staying concealed. Decision made, Nick headed northwest but stayed below the main ridgeline, moving through terrain that would be invisible to anyone watching from standard vantage points. His natural orientation ability kept him on course despite the lack of established trails. 20 minutes of careful movement brought him to an observation point where he could see the route marked on the hand-drawn map. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. Someone had prepared the area like a military operation, motion sensors placed at strategic intervals. Thin wire stretched across natural choke points, not enough to cause injury, but enough to signal movement. Small reflectors positioned to catch sunlight and blind anyone approaching from specific directions. This wasn't the work of some unhinged civilian. This was professional-level area denial, set up by someone who understood tactical movement and psychological pressure. Nick settled into concealment and activated his exceptional tracking ability, reading the area for sign of recent human passage. What he found told a disturbing story. Multiple boot prints, but only one set going in both directions. The others, presumably the 3 researchers, had been walked in but not walked out. Drag marks in 2 locations suggested people who were unconscious or restrained. Equipment scattered in patterns that suggested struggle, then careful cleanup. The researchers were prisoners, not partners, and whoever held them had spent significant time preparing this location for Nick's arrival. His human presence detection ability suddenly flared again. Stronger this time, more focused. Someone was approaching his position from the southeast, moving with the careful precision of trained infantry. Nick relocated quietly, using his natural orientation ability to navigate through terrain where the approaching person couldn't track him easily. As he moved, he caught his first glimpse of his opponent. Tall man, maybe 6'2", moving with military bearing. Dark clothing, professional equipment, complete situational awareness. Face partially concealed, but Nick could see enough to estimate age at 45 to 50. The way he moved suggested someone accustomed to command authority and tactical planning. More importantly, the man was carrying military-grade electronics, communication gear, GPS jamming equipment, and what looked like a tablet computer for coordinating the various sensors and traps he'd deployed. Nick's investigative intuition began piecing together a profile. Former military officer, probably special operations background, with access to restricted equipment and advanced training in psychological warfare. Someone who'd studied Nick's career specifically and designed this entire scenario as a personal challenge. But why? The answer came 15 minutes later when Nick managed to get close enough to overhear radio communication. Phase 2 complete, the man said into a throat microphone. Target has deviated from prescribed route as expected. Tracking ability confirmed superior to briefing materials. proceeding to phase 3. A pause then. Understood. Yes, I'm recording everything. The clients will have complete documentation of his capabilities. Clients. This wasn't personal vendetta or psychological break. This was business. Someone was paying to have Nick's abilities tested, documented, and presumably demonstrated for potential buyers. Human trafficking, but specialized. Trafficking of specific skills rather than generic labor. Someone wanted to know exactly what a master tracker could do under pressure. Probably as prelude to either recruitment or elimination, Nick had walked into a professional evaluation designed to measure his worth on some very dark market. The realization changed everything. This wasn't about rescuing 3 researchers or even about surviving some madman's game. This was about preventing his own capabilities from being sold to whoever had commissioned this demonstration. Time to go on the offensive. Nick's spatial memory provided detailed recall of the terrain ahead. A natural bowl surrounded by ridgelines with limited visibility and multiple concealment positions. Perfect place for the kind of close-quarters maneuvering that would neutralize his opponent's technological advantages. He circled wide, using his natural orientation ability to approach the confrontation area from the one direction his opponent wouldn't expect, directly from above, down the steepest and most difficult descent route. 20 minutes of careful climbing brought him to an overlooked position where he could observe the entire operation. 3 people zip-tied to trees in a small clearing, 2 middle-aged adults and 1 young woman, all conscious but obviously terrified. The researchers, alive but captive. Around the clearing, the man who called himself the architect had set up a sophisticated command post with multiple screens, communication equipment, and what looked like recording devices. Professional documentation of everything that was happening. Nick was studying approach routes when a voice spoke directly behind him. Impressive work, Reynolds. Most people would have followed the marked trail straight into the obvious trap. Nick spun around to find himself facing the man he'd been tracking, who was now pointing a military-grade tranquilizer pistol at his chest. Up close, Nick could see intelligent eyes, graying hair, and the kind of controlled confidence that came from years of successful command. "You're faster than my briefing materials suggested," the man continued. "And your route selection shows tactical thinking I wasn't expecting from a park ranger. My name is James Thornfield, though my associates call me the architect. I design scenarios." "What kind of scenarios?" "Tests, evaluations, demonstrations of human capability under stress." Thornfield gestured toward the command post with obvious pride. "Today's scenario was commissioned by parties interested in your particular skill set. They wanted to know if the stories about Nick Reynolds were true or just wilderness mythology." Nick kept his hands visible but shifted his weight imperceptibly, preparing for the moment when Thornfield's attention would waver. "What stories?" "The Glacier National Park rescue records make fascinating reading. 67 successful searches, 0 fatalities, multiple impossible finds in conditions that defeated other search teams. Either you're phenomenally lucky, or you possess genuinely exceptional tracking and intuitive abilities." Thornfield's voice carried genuine curiosity, almost academic interest. "My clients need people with your capabilities for operations in challenging terrain. But they wanted proof of concept before making an investment. So you kidnapped 3 innocent people to test me. I prefer recruited temporary participants. They're unharmed and will be released regardless of outcome." Thornfield paused. "Though I should mention that your performance determines whether they're released immediately or later." The threat was casual, matter-of-fact, delivered without emotion. Nick recognized the tone, someone who'd crossed moral lines so many times that threatening civilian lives had become routine business practice. "What happened to you?" Nick asked, genuinely curious. "Military background, obviously. Special operations, probably intelligence. How does someone go from serving their country to kidnapping researchers?" For the first time, Thornfield's professional composure cracked slightly. You want my origin story? Fair enough. You've earned it with your performance so far. Thornfield kept the tranquilizer pistol trained on Nick, but settled into a more comfortable position, clearly prepared to explain himself. Operation Desert Thunder, 15 years ago. Classified mission, small unit, deep infiltration. I was team leader for 12 of the finest soldiers I've ever known. His voice took on the particular cadence of someone recounting a story he'd told many times, but only to himself. The mission failed because of Washington politics and Pentagon incompetence. My men died not from enemy action, but from bureaucratic cowardice. 12 good soldiers dead because desk jockeys couldn't make hard decisions. Nick listened, watching for any moment when Thornfield's attention might shift away from the weapon. After that, I spent 3 years in therapy, 2 years drinking myself to death, and 1 year deciding that the entire system was fundamentally broken. Society rewards mediocrity and punishes excellence. It promotes the weak and discards the capable. Thornfield's eyes had taken on the particular intensity of someone explaining a deeply held belief system. So I developed a new mission. I identify genuinely capable individuals and test them under real conditions. Those who pass get opportunities to use their skills productively. Those who fail, he shrugged, natural selection. And you think kidnapping people and running them through death traps makes you some kind of evolutionary improvement? I think most people are evolutionary dead weight, Thornfield replied calmly. But occasionally someone like you comes along, someone genuinely exceptional, someone who could make a real difference in the right circumstances. Nick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. What kind of circumstances? Private security, corporate extraction, government contracts that require discretion. There's a significant market for someone with your abilities properly managed. Properly managed? Thornfield smiled, the first genuine expression Nick had seen from him. Think of me as a talent agent for the morally flexible. I find exceptional people, test their capabilities, and connect them with clients who can use those capabilities productively. Human trafficking. Human optimization. Thornfield's voice carried complete conviction. I'm offering you the chance to use your skills for something more meaningful than finding lost hikers. Real challenges, real rewards, real impact on global events. Nick stared at him, recognizing the particular combination of intelligence and moral bankruptcy that created the most dangerous type of opponent. Someone who'd convinced himself that his crimes were actually virtues. And if I refuse, then you fail the evaluation, and the market has no use for failed assets. Thornfield raised the tranquilizer pistol slightly. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're too curious about how this ends. Nick realized that Thornfield was right about one thing. He was curious. Not about the job offer, but about whether someone that smart could be that stupid. You've made some tactical errors, Nick said conversationally. Thornfield raised an eyebrow. Such as, you're standing uphill from me on loose ground, you're backlit against the sky, and you've been talking long enough that I've located all your equipment positions. Interesting observations, but you're forgetting that I'm holding a weapon, and you're not. You're also forgetting something important about exceptional tracking ability, Nick said, and smiled. Which is, it works both ways. I don't just find tracks, I avoid leaving them. Thornfield frowned, suddenly uncertain. The boot prints you've been following for the last 20 minutes? They're not mine. I've been paralleling you through terrain where I don't leave sign, while you've been following tracks I laid down an hour ago. Understanding dawned in Thornfield's eyes, just as Nick's spatial memory provided the exact timing he'd been calculating. The loose shale under Thornfield's feet shifted right on schedule. causing him to step sideways for balance and move the tranquilizer pistol off target for exactly the 2 seconds Nick needed. Nick's investigative intuition had identified the perfect moment. His natural orientation ability had positioned him for optimal leverage, and his exceptional tracking skills had misdirected his opponent into vulnerable terrain. All 6 special abilities working together in a coordinated response that no amount of tactical planning could have anticipated. The fight was brief and decisive. Thornfield was strong and well-trained, but Nick had spent 5 years dealing with dangerous situations in difficult terrain. More importantly, he was fighting for 3 innocent lives instead of for money and ego. When it was over, Thornfield lay unconscious beside his expensive equipment, zip-tied with his own restraints. Nick used Thornfield's radio to call for backup, then spent the next 30 minutes documenting everything: the equipment, the setup, the recorded conversations, the client contact information stored on Thornfield's devices. By the time the FBI helicopter arrived, Nick had assembled a complete intelligence package that would lead to arrests and prosecutions extending far beyond one fallen military officer. The 3 researchers were shaken but unharmed. Dr. Chen thanked him repeatedly. Dr. Kessler wanted to know how he'd found them. Lisa Park asked if this kind of thing happened often. More often than it should, Nick told her, but less often than it could. Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force reviewed Nick's documentation with obvious appreciation. "This is some of the best field intelligence I've seen. You ever consider a career change?" "I like my current job," Nick replied. "Quiet, predictable, nobody trying to sell me to international criminals." But as the helicopter lifted off with Thornfield in custody, Nick realized something had changed. For 5 years, he'd been living quietly, using his abilities for simple search and rescue, avoiding anything that might remind him of the more dangerous aspects of his ranger career. Today had reminded him that exceptional abilities carried exceptional responsibilities. There were people like Thornfield operating throughout the world, and there were very few people with the skills to stop them. Maybe it was time to consider expanding his definition of search and rescue. His phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Mitchell. "If you ever want to hunt bigger predators, call me." Nick looked out over the Glacier National Park wilderness, thinking about 12 dead soldiers and 3 researchers who'd almost become casualties of one man's twisted philosophy, thinking about other Thornfields operating in other locations, testing other victims, selling human capabilities to the highest bidder. His exceptional tracking ability could find more than lost hikers. His nature reading could identify more than animal behavior. His investigative intuition could solve more than wilderness mysteries. The wilderness had taught him that predators were part of the natural order, but they had to be kept in balance. When predators became too numerous or too successful, they threatened the entire ecosystem. Maybe it was time to restore some balance. Nick pocketed Agent Mitchell's card and started the long walk back to his truck. Behind him, the sun was setting over the Montana peaks, casting long shadows across terrain that looked peaceful but had hosted a deadly game. Tomorrow, he'd call Agent Mitchell. Tonight, he'd go home to his quiet cabin and think about what it meant to be exceptional in a world where exceptional people were increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The wilderness had always been his sanctuary, but today it had reminded him of something he'd forgotten during 5 years of peaceful retirement. Sanctuaries were only safe as long as someone was willing to guard them. Time to start guarding again.